Hello, Taylor Ellwood here, and tonight I'm going to be talking about how to do internal work around long-term issues, and I'm building this off of the video that I did last week, where I was talking about how to dissolve shock. But I'm also sharing this because, of course, um, I just think it's an important thing to explore because sometimes we do have long-term issues in our lives that we need to work through, and I'm certainly no stranger to that myself because I've been that person and I am that person. I mean, even this week I had an issue where I had shared a blog entry and someone commented about it, comparing my work to someone else's work. And that person's work had come along much later than mine, and I got a little irritable about it because it was like, it's just basically like, well, I've been doing this a lot longer. And and so what it came right down to, what it boiled down to, was a feeling of wanting my work to be recognized and not having it recognized. And so I was all clenched up in regards to that. I had a blockage there. And of course, I mean, I had a couple different choices. I could have worked through it, or I could have done what I did, which is irritably respond. And of course, I irritably responded. That's more on me than anything else. But I mean, it's a good example of how you can have a long-term issue that you think that you've worked through, and then it nonetheless rears its head, and you realize you have more work to do. One of the things I find is that there's a belief in regards to doing internal work that people will sometimes have, where they'll be like, okay, I've recognized this issue. I've identified it and acknowledged it, and I'm working through it. And if I get it worked through all in one shot, that'll solve all my problems. And they'll think, well, you know, they'll be like, okay, like I'm depressed, for example, and I'll do this meditation technique, and I'll work through my depression, and then my depression will be gone, and that'll be it. And I think that's a dangerous belief to have when it comes to doing internal work, because the fact is that, yeah, you can sometimes work through some things in one go. Like when I talked last week about working through shock, you have the shock of an event occur. You can do some meditation and dissolving work around that shock, especially if you do it like right after it's happened, and you can work through that pretty quickly if you're fortunate. Then again, sometimes you can't, and you might still be dealing with the after effects of that shock. Either way, it can be one of those things where, sometimes you can get it done in one go, and sometimes you don't get it done in one go. But then you have an issue like depression, or maybe you have an issue around something else, like maybe you feel a sense of emptiness in your life, or maybe you feel angry about something, or whatever else. And you're doing your breath work, you're doing your meditation and everything else. You're sitting with that issue, and you're working through it, and you think you get it done, and then a little while later it rears its head, and you're like, well, what happened? Why didn't that get done in one shot? And the answer to that is because you may have worked through the most obvious symptom of it, but there may be further, deeper work to do. In fact, I would tell you, as someone who's been doing internal work since 2004, like on a daily, regular basis, that such work is not done quickly. It is done over the long haul. And you might say then at that point, well, Taylor, why even bother doing that work if it's something that is done over the long haul? I mean, I want something that solves my problems now. I want something that allows me to work through my issues in the moment, and so I can live a happy life. And my answer to that would be, well, doing internal work can certainly lead you to a happier, more proactive life. But it's something that still requires some dedication over the long haul. It's not something that's done just in the moment. It's something that takes some time. And people who want a quick fix are going to be disappointed, because there really is no such thing as a quick fix in life. Look, I'm not going to tell you that you can't work through stuff like via meditation or stuff like that, because you certainly can, and I certainly have. But I'll tell you that, like, even in the work that I've done, I still have sometimes had to do additional work. Like, there was a point in time where I was doing a lot of work around the feeling of anger in my life because I didn't have a healthy relationship with anger. I didn't know how to handle it very well. I had repressed it for a long time, and then when I would express it, I would end up exploding like a volcano because that's how my dad handled anger, and that was what was modeled to me. And I've done a ton of work around that emotion, and overall, I would say I've gotten a lot better about it. But there's still the rare occasion under the right circumstances where I will explode like a volcano. And what that really tells me is that I still have work to do around it. And I've continued doing work around that emotion as a result. I think it's important for us to acknowledge the value of something like doing internal work, like doing a practice like dissolving meditation, but also to recognize the limitations. And the limitation is that this isn't something that you could just do like that. It's something that takes dedicated and required work over the long haul. You do see changes over time as you continue to work through stuff, as you continue to work through the traumas and the issues and things like that. You do see benefits from it. Your life becomes less dramatic. Your life becomes more ordered and focused. You find yourself responding less to people in certain ways and better in other ways. But it doesn't automatically mean that it's solved. Like and I'll use myself as an example. I've done a fair amount of work around my issues around recognition because I've realized that if I trace those issues back, fundamentally it has to do with the fact that, you know, as a kid, I didn't feel recognized by my dad. So it's a daddy issue. Well, I mean, I've worked around and through a lot of that, but that issue still rears its head sometimes. And you might say, well, what's the point then? Well, the point is that it rears its head a lot less than it used to. The point is that I've made enough progress with it that it doesn't control my life in the same way that it could. But it doesn't change the fact that sometimes that issue still comes up. Well, what can I do about it then? Well, what I can do about it is I can recognize when it comes up and keep doing the work. I can do the best that I can to catch myself and work through it and address it in a manner that's proactive and that leads to healthier expressions of it. I can continue to do that work, and I can also, as needed, if I really need to, I can also get the help from other people. You know, I can talk to a therapist, for example, about some of this stuff. For example, when I was doing my work around emptiness, I ended up working with a therapist because it became very apparent to me like a month in that I was digging into some very deep psychic wounds around emptiness because I did not have a healthy relationship with emptiness. I had a very unhealthy relationship. I used to cut myself, for example, in order to make myself feel something when I felt empty. And I haven't done that in a long time. But still, like, and this was back in 2009. 2000, it was 2009. Um, I had a lot of unhealthy experiences around emptiness, and I had to learn how to undo that stuff, but doing it on my own simply wasn't going to work. So, I would do my dissolving practice, but I would also meet and talk with a therapist each week about what I was working through and the realizations that I had, and getting that objective perspective helped as well. And that's why I think that when you do internal work, when you're doing a practice like dissolving, where you're resting your consciousness on an area where you're feeling internal tension and you're feeling energetic tension and emotional tension, and you're working through that and you're gradually releasing and relaxing it. I think it behooves you to necessarily recognize, like, especially if you're going into deeper wounds, that you might need to get additional help, and that's perfectly okay. In fact, that's a perfectly sane and healthy thing to do, instead of just trying to white knuckle it and do it on your own. And I say this as someone who has sometimes white knuckled it and done it on my own, where in retrospect I could have used some help. Like in the case of the emptiness work, I mean, the main reason I ended up seeing the therapist was because my partner at the time said, "Look, I cannot handle what you're going through on your own. You need to get help, or we're gonna have to look at fundamental changes in the relationship." Well, I went and got that help. The relationship ended up changing anyway, and part of that was because of the work around emptiness. Because as I continued to do that work, and I continued to talk with a therapist, I came to some fundamental understandings, and she came to some fundamental understandings, and we realized we just weren't compatible. But at the same time, I would say in retrospect, I really appreciated that she put that boundary out there. What would have been better is if I had had that boundary. And, since then, I've applied that standard to myself, and I've said sometimes, like, I need help with X, I need help with Y, and I've gone and gotten that help. And that's one of the things that's really important, is like you have to know when to get that help for yourself, when to go and do the necessary work that you need to do in order to transform yourself, but also knowing when to get that help. And I share that here because I think that, a lot of times, people, we hear, yeah, do meditation, and that'll sort your problems out. Well, yes and no. Because here's the thing, when you do meditation and internal work, sometimes it can make the issues you're dealing with worse initially. The reason why is because you're going in there and you're unpacking those issues. Now, if you have trauma around something and you've had it tightly packed up and you suddenly release it, well, guess what? Now you're suddenly facing that trauma. You're suddenly dealing with it. And if you're not prepared for that, that's where you have to recognize this is going to be long-term work. I always recommend when I do internal work and I talk about people doing internal work to never do more than what you are comfortably able to do. What I mean by that is, let's say I'm doing internal work and I'm doing some dissolving around a blockage, and I start to find some emotions and memories come up that are really unpleasant, and I'm not ready to deal with them yet. That's where I'm going to stop the dissolving work, and I'm just going to let myself process what I've encountered and worked through to the point that I'm able to do it. And I may not come back to that blockage until I'm ready to proceed further. But when I'm ready to proceed, then I'll go into it deeper. And an example of this would be, some work I did that actually allowed me to uncover some very early trauma in my life. I ended up doing some dissolving work um, around a sensation that I was feeling in my body. And in that sensation, it ended up being a sensation around my genitals, and I ended up discovering, really uncovering some memories that I had blocked about being molested as a young kid. Initially, I would get to a certain point where I started to feel really uncomfortable, and I would just stop and be there, and I wouldn't go any further until I was ready. And so I share that as well because sometimes it's really important to to recognize again what your limitations are. And if you need help, to get that help, but to only go as far as you are able to go. Don't go further than what you're capable of doing. And if you can remember that and you can treat yourself in that way where you're doing this internal work and you're gradually loosening and releasing the stuff, but you're not going any further than what you can comfortably handle, then yes, over time you can dissolve a lot of stuff, and you'll find that your life becomes a lot easier to live because you're not reacting to things. But again, sometimes you're going to find that under the right circumstances, there's still some triggers that need to be worked through and resolved. And this isn't a reflection on you, and it's not a reflection on the internal work. It's simply a reality that, as we do, the more internal work you do and the more organized and structured life gets, the better off you are. But there still doesn't change the fact that you may still sometimes have to do some work, and that this is a long-term process. If I compare myself to who I was in 2004 or even 2010, I would say, like 2004, I was an utter mess. Like I did not have my life together at all in any way, shape, or form. And in 2010, having done internal work for 6 years at that point, I had my life together somewhat. I still was a hot mess in a lot of ways. And then I look at like where I am now and compare myself to 2010, and I'm like, yeah, 10 years later, I've got my life together a lot more. And a lot of that's because of the continued work that I've done. But think about that. I mean, that's 16 years of internal work compared to everything else that happened before my life, for one thing, where I wasn't doing that internal work, and also really just the fact that it's taken me 16 years to get to this point. Now, someone who watches this video might despair and say, "Well, what's the point then?" And again, my point is that your life does get better, and if you're doing some type of dedicated internal work, yes, that can help you. It's one tool among many. And ideally, you're using all the tools you need to use. Don't try to white knuckle it. Recognize the stuff that you're working through and learn to let go and relax and release, because that's going to make the difference in your life. All right, thanks for watching, and I will catch you guys at some point in the next week.